If you're wondering what exactly is a chiastic structure, or if you already know but want to learn more about this structure and how it's used in the Bible, then this video is for you. We'll talk about what a chiastic structure is, why it's called chiastic, and we'll share some really fascinating examples of this structure that you don't want to miss. All right, so what is a chiastic structure? A chiastic structure is a literary technique in which a certain sequence or series of words, phrases, or themes in a text is repeated in reverse order. So, for example, let's say we have a sequence of 3 words or phrases or themes, which I'm simply going to call A, B, and C. In a chiastic structure, that sequence would be repeated not in the same order as in A prime, B prime, C prime, but in reverse order. So, C prime, B prime, A prime. Take a look at this sentence, for example. You forget what you want to remember, and you remember what you want to forget. So here we have 3 elements. Forget, which we'll call A, what you want, which we'll call B, and remember, which would be C. And these 3 elements are then repeated in reverse order. First comes remember, then what you want, and then forget. So that's the basic setup of a chiastic structure, but in many cases there's one additional element at the very center, in this case D, that is not repeated, which the author or speaker wants to highlight in a special way. So that means a chiastic structure with a sequence of 3 elements could look either like this or like this. Okay, but why is this kind of an arrangement called chiastic? Well, the simple answer is that it has to do with a letter from the Greek alphabet called chi, and this letter is made up of 2 crossing lines, so it looks like an X, which is basically the shape of a simple chiastic structure where the elements are arranged crosswise. So the first element is not repeated in the 3rd, but in the 4th position, and the second element is not repeated in the 4th, but in the 3rd position. Now, as you might have already guessed from the connection to the Greek alphabet, chiastic structures have been around for quite a long time. And they're actually very, very common in ancient literature. You can find them, for example, in the famous poems Iliad and Odyssey by the Greek author Homer, or in the writings of the well-known Greek historian Herodotus, and you can find them in the Bible. In fact, chiastic structures play a huge role in the Bible, not just because they're pretty much everywhere in this book, but also because they're one of the key ways the biblical authors highlight things that are important. In other words, it's one of the key ways they communicate with us as readers, which basically means if you want to understand the Bible better and discover what the biblical authors are really saying, you should definitely pay attention to chiastic structures when you study this book. Okay, so now that we're a bit more familiar with the chiastic structure, let's actually take a look at a couple of examples from the Bible, and we'll start with one in the Old Testament, and then we'll look at one in the New Testament. Now, the passage we're going to look at in the Old Testament is a story that you've most likely heard about, even if you've never read the Bible before. And that is the story of the Tower of Babel in Genesis chapter 11. Okay, so book of Genesis, the very first book of the Bible, chapter 11. So this is the time after the flood. In Genesis chapter 10, we have the so-called Table of Nations that tells us about the descendants of Noah's 3 sons. And then comes chapter 11, where we read about some people who journey eastward and they find a plain where they decide to build a city and a tower whose top will reach into heaven. So they go ahead and they start building, but then God comes down to see what they're doing and ends up scattering them over the face of the whole earth. So that's the basic storyline, and already here you can see the outline of the chiastic structure, in the sense that what happens in the first part of the story is reversed in the second part. So in the first part, they journey to a place and begin building, while in the second part, they stop building and are scattered. So we can already see the general outline of the structure, and the whole thing becomes even clearer once we take a closer look at the text and pay attention to repeated words and ideas in the story. Notice that the story begins with an introductory statement in verse 1 about the whole earth having one language. Then in verse 2, there's a journey to a certain place, and a place name is given, which is the land of Shinar. In verses 3 and 4, we have a couple of speeches that begin with the phrase, "Come, let us." And in verse 4, there's a city and a tower that the people want to build. So that's our sequence of elements in the first part of the story. And this sequence is repeated in reverse order in the second part of the story. In verse 5, we again hear about the city and the tower which the people built. In verse 7, God makes a speech that begins with the phrase, "Come, let us." In verse 8, the people are scattered. And at the beginning of verse 9, another place name is given, which is Babel. And the story ends with a concluding statement that again mentions the language of the whole earth. So that's the setup, but as you may have already noticed, there's one additional element that's not repeated, and that's the statement about God coming down to see in verse 5. So that's the center of the structure, which makes sense because it's the turning point of the story, and it's also the thing the author wants to highlight in a special way. So if you want to understand what this story is all about and what the message is that the author is trying to get across, you need to pay special attention to this part of the text and think about the significance of this statement. All right, so that was an example from the Old Testament. Now let's go to the New Testament, and the text we're going to look at there is the well-known story of Saul, who later became Paul, meeting Jesus on the road to Damascus. And we find this story in the book of Acts, and there in chapter 9. Okay, so book of Acts in the New Testament, right after the Gospels, book of Acts chapter 9. And we're going to focus just on the first 8 verses in this chapter. So if you look at the beginning of the story, you see that it starts in verses 1 and 2 with Saul wanting to go to Damascus in order to lead people bound to Jerusalem. Then when he's close to Damascus, there's a light from heaven that flashes around him. And then in verse 4, he falls to the ground and hears a voice. Okay, so that's our sequence of elements. And now watch how this is repeated in reverse order in the second half of the story. So in verse 7, it says that the men who were with him heard a voice. In verse 8, Saul gets up from the ground, but when he opens his eyes, there's only darkness because he can't see anything. And then instead of him leading people to Jerusalem, it is he that is led to Damascus. So again, we have a sequence of elements that's repeated in reverse order, but just like in the Tower of Babel story, there's one part of the text that is not repeated, and that is the dialogue between Saul and Jesus in verses 4, 5, and 6, which again is the turning point of the story and the part of the story that the author really wants to draw our attention to by arranging the text the way he did. So when you're studying this text, really focus on that central dialogue and what is being said there. Now, those are just 2 of literally thousands of chiastic structures in the Bible, which means there's plenty left for you to discover on your own. And if you want to learn how to do that, and where to look for these structures, then you really need to watch this video next, where I talk about 6 different types of chiastic structures in the Bible. Super, super fascinating. So go watch that next, and I'll see you there.